Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. When U.S. Special Envoy for Iran Rob Malley testified last week in a Senate committee on the Biden administration's policy, he expressed a rather pessimistic view of the prospects for reinvigorating the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran. Such a deal, he said, was better than the present situation because without it, quote, Iran advanced its program by accumulating sufficient quantities of enriched uranium and making technological gains that have left the breakout time as short as roughly a few weeks, limiting our window to warn of and react. The problem is exacerbated, he said, by international inspectors at the International Atomic Energy Agency having less information and access to detect and deter Iranian attempt to pursue covert activities. Is that really the case? And if so, what are the implications thereof? To deliberate this matter, we're joined all the way from the United States in New York City by Dr. Olli Heinonen, who is the former Deputy Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency and a distinguished fellow at Stimson Center at Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Heinonen.
Thank you.
Also joining us here in the studio is retired Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the co-host of TV7 Middle East Review, Powers in Play co-panelist, the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, as well as the Editor-in-Chief of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune, among a long list of other titles. Welcome, Eran, and also...
And an admirer of Mr. Heinonen's work.
Indeed, that is true for each and every one of us. Joining us also is Mr. Amir Oren, TV7's editor-at-large and host of TV7 Watchmen Talk and Powers in Play. Mr. Oren, thank you for joining us as well, and I'd like to immediately dive into today's topic. To what degree is the development of Iran's nuclear program at a critical stage in which, at the one hand, even though the Biden administration seeks to reinvigorate the 2015 nuclear agreement, it does not necessarily meet the requirements in order to limit Tehran's ambitions. But on the other hand, we do see that there is still a certain room for maneuver that, at least in the eyes of the Biden administration, allows it to continue the diplomatic track, which seems to be fatally there. It doesn't show a lot of optimism at this stage.
So yes, it is a crucial stage, and this is exactly the impression that Iran wants you to have. Because if you look at the timeline, former President Trump went out of the deal in 2018. In early 2019, the Iranian regime started interfering with the IAEA inspectors and started violating on its own part the nuclear deal. And in February of last year, a few weeks after President Biden took office, they accelerated the violations as a signal to Biden to come back to the table indirectly and cut a deal or recut the deal. Now, over the last 3 months, from approximately mid-February to mid-May, they enriched uranium to 60% by almost half of the quantity which they now have, which is more than 43 kilograms. Obviously, they are trying to calibrate their advance so that it will be sort of a warning, but not too hasty so that it will trigger either an Israeli or an American attack on their facilities.
Indeed. Earlier this week, there were two reports, at least by the IAEA Director General, Rafael Mariano Grossi, circulated amongst the Board of Governors with regard to Iran's nuclear advances. And I'd like to take this opportunity, Dr. Heinonen, to what degree within those documents was a sense of alarm that was distinguished to a certain degree from previous reports that were less condemning, if you will, with regard to Tehran's defiance of nuclear constraints?
I think that this report sent three messages. The first one is that Iran is still improving its uranium enrichment capabilities, hardening the facilities where those capabilities are, going underground, etc., making it more difficult for any military action, and builds additional centrifuges and additional enrichment capabilities, which actually even JCPOA doesn't totally block. So this is one message. The second message is this one, which is already mentioned, that they gradually increase the inventory of enriched uranium. If you look at 20% enriched uranium and 60% uranium inventory together, it's enough for 2-3 nuclear weapons if they decide to break out. And that will take only a few months to process those with this fleet of centrifuges which they have. And then the third message is the stalling on answering to the questions. The tactic which they have used all the way from 2003 until today. They don't answer to the IAEA questions. They delay answers, give incomplete answers or false information. And the way the IAEA Secretariat has to work is always check what is told to them, even though they might know from the very beginning this is false information. So this tactic is there, and Iran uses it skillfully to buy time. And again, actually, this is also non-compliance for JCPOA, because IAEA has also used, for example, complementary access in these cases, and those access has been denied. It has not been very much emphasized in the IAEA report. So I see that they send all the time messages of small non-compliance, and the IAEA board is not picking it up, nor the Security Council. So they feel that they are now in a strong position to negotiate, and I have to admit they are much better position than 2 years ago. And now its ball is in the corner of the IAEA Board of Governors, who has finally to act, because after this summer, they will have enough material perhaps for 3 or 4 nuclear weapons. Actually, exactly the amount of material which was the original Ahmad plan.
Very interesting indeed, and alarming. If I may add, Dr. Lerman, your take on this?
Well, I think that actually the conjunction of Iranian activities and the implicit messages in Gross's report that Heinonen was describing brings us to the point in which the masks are falling. It was possible for our American friends and our European interlocutors to pretend somehow that what was stated in the first page of the JCPOA, namely that this is not a military project, can somehow be upheld. This is no longer the case. You do not enrich the 60% for any other purpose. You do not hide the nature of your activities for any other purpose. And we are looking at the point in which the Board of Governors will have to deal directly with the fact that this is a military nuclear program, something that Israel has been arguing for years. This is the reason Israel stole the famous archive 4 years ago. But essentially there were means and ways for those who did not want to face that reality to avoid this stark statement of realities. I think the point is fast approaching. Perhaps the Iranians want a confrontation in order to force the hand of the Biden administration. But I think the Biden administration is also losing patience with Iranian tactics. And we are coming to a fork in the road in which either the Iranians drop their demand for IRGC delisting, which is dead. The Biden administration has made it very clear they will not and cannot deliver on it. Or, alternatively, Iranians will bear the responsibility for the collapse of the negotiations and the need for all of us to start thinking quickly and effectively about a plan B. I would say one thing. Regardless of the question of who is responsible for certain dramatic events inside Iran last year, this year, I would say that in the minds of the Iranians, they are more naked than they would like to be in terms of what intelligence services in the West, including the intelligence services of Israel, know about their activity. So they would need to actually measure their actions very carefully, because, as you said, this could trigger action. From a certain point onwards, this could trigger action.
And yet, if we're looking back at the testimony by Rob Malley to the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee, he was quite clear about stating that, in his view, thinking that maybe this is the view of everyone, military action is not an alternative, even though he did emphasize, yes, and acknowledge that all options are on the table from President Biden's perspective. But when we're talking about a military option, the consequences will be far-reaching, but nonetheless, it's there.
Well, Biden has been very careful not to mention the military option. All he said was other means. And of course, it's open to interpretation. Now, I have never been to the Dimona reactor, only to the other one, Sorek, which is not so secretive. But I've seen enough to know that in a reactor you have the core and whatever surrounds it. And this is a metaphor for what we are facing here. We have the core, which is the negotiation about the JCPOA being revived, and you have external issues such as the delisting of the IRGC, or at least the Quds force within it. So what happened in regard to those events which Iran mentioned in Iran recently is that the Iranians are probably being forced to consider retaliation for the assassination of one of their senior officers. And therefore, there was a travel warning issued by the Israeli authorities regarding travel by Israeli citizens to countries which neighbor Iran, mostly Turkey. Now, one may say, if one tends to read Machiavelli, that Israel did it in order for the Iranians to retaliate so that a delisting would be impossible, because what you mentioned regarding the delisting has not been officially announced by the administration. It's in the works, it's been briefed to Congress, but it's not yet set in stone. So rather than involve ourselves in the JCPOA core itself, we are now surrounding the envelope. And if that, for some reason, is taken care of, we'll be back at the core.
Dr. Heinonen, you just mentioned 3 to 4 nuclear warheads that may be, or enough fissile material for 3-4 bombs by the end of the summer. What is the speed in which the Iranians could actually reach that breakout time, considering the fact also, and bringing that into account, even though we do not know to what degree the intelligence community is
neither do they.
Deeply infiltrated, and neither do they, indeed. Nonetheless, when we're looking at the report of the IAEA, Grossi clearly states that since 2021, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors have not had access to any of the monitoring files that are still working, but without access, you don't really know what they're doing there.
That's true. Your surveillance might be inconclusive, maybe even stopped. You really don't know what you see on the images. Or there may have been events which have a relevance and you have not yet seen. So I don't think we should count too much on those images which are there. And I think that also another one which has stayed entirely in a laguna is the monitoring of these military-related activities. Actually, IAEA has not done practically anything at all on that part of the JCPOA. And this brings me to the breakout time. When a state decides to leave its nuclear obligations and go for nuclear weapons, it doesn't do it in such a way that first it produces the fissile material for that weapon and then starts to scratch its head how to develop a weapon itself and then the delivery vehicle. Those three activities went parallel in the Ahmad program. And we don't know how far they got in the weaponization itself. There are some indications in the documentation, but we don't know, the archives, but we don't know what work they have been doing after 2004. But what we know that they have worked pretty much with the missile technologies and new missiles, much better missiles than Shahab 3, including missiles with the solid fuel. I take by definition that many of these missiles are capable to deliver a nuclear warhead. So that is there. And the question is really this middle part, that what did Mr. Fakhrizadeh, what did Mr. Abbasi Davani do, what kind of meetings they had after 2004 and at least until 2010? What was going on those meetings and who were the people and what were the issues they were working? And now I can only imagine if the IAEA goes and asks those questions, there will be stalling from the Iranian side. So I don't see this as a very nice situation. It may be that Iran is playing with the ambiguity here, but they may actually have a plan. And I remind you a little bit about the history of Manhattan Project and the weapon dropped to Hiroshima. The weapon, the fissile material for the weapon was completed just a few weeks before this bomb unfortunately landed in Hiroshima. So the US didn't wait in 1940s to develop nuclear weapon. It was there. So I'm sure any country which is planning to do it does the same procedure. All these things, the three things go parallel.
Indeed. Mr. Owen,
if I may just interject, I wouldn't presume to suggest either to Olli or to Eran, who has a very long and distinguished history with both military intelligence and the national security staff, how intelligence is being collected. But if I could assume that not all intelligence on the Iranian infrastructure is being collected at the sites, but rather when it is reported to the leadership, even though sometimes even that needs corroboration because the Iranians themselves may not be as precise about their own activities as some outside observers might be.
Indeed, and moreover, Dr. Lerman, when we're talking about the collection of intelligence, obviously there is some complementary work to ensure that this parallel track that Dr. Heinonen spoke of is being exposed to a certain degree within the covert circles.
Well, I don't want to speak specifically to intelligence collection capabilities. I would say, again, one thing. What may or may not be the case, in fact, in the mind of the Iranian regime, there needs to be a healthy doubt as to their ability to avoid intelligence detection in a situation where their chief of program can be killed on his way to lunch, and one of their key officers can be taken off at a precise point in the middle of Tehran. They need to have a healthy dose of, let's say, caution about the notion that they can actually achieve a breakthrough to a bomb without the world knowing it. Now, I think that what Amir said earlier, that we are in the periphery rather than the core, I'm not entirely sure that this is the way I would look at it. At the core of the entire story is the Iranian regime's notion that they can defy the international community, dictate terms to the United States, sit in Vienna and determine at which point the Americans would be allowed into the room. In other words, it is the sense that they have the whip hand in this situation. And the key to what will happen now is whether the Board of Governors, by its own actions, the United States, by its determinations, the European allies, which for a very long time have been very forgiving of Iran's activities, perhaps because they resented, perhaps for good reason, the Trump's unilateral decisions. But if all of them come together and convey to the Iranians at this crucial junction a sense that they do not control the situation anymore, that the control is shifted back to the international community and its actions, that serious consequences may be on their way under Chapter 7, language that has been with us in the early years of the Obama administration. UN Security Council Resolution 1929 was under Chapter 7, that the Iranians should be reminded their activities are deemed by the international community to be in breach of the peace and acts of aggression under Chapter 7. Once this could perhaps shake Raisi and Khamenei out of their current complacency.
And yet, when we're looking at, with all due respect to Chapter 7 and the whole aspect of such displayed resolve, such resolve needs to have also political will behind it, which is lacking both in the United States and Europe at this stage.
But it's not lacking at the end of the day in Israel.
Indeed. Mr. Oren?
But because of the Ukraine business and the looming Taiwan crisis, there is no unity among the P5. And therefore, what was so evident in 2015, when the 7 parties, including the EU, coalesced to get whatever they could out of Iran, may not be present now. And Iran may still try to play, at least try to have a wedge between the United States, Russia, and China and use it to its advantage.
Well, very quickly, the irony of ironies is at the moment Russia and Iran are at loggerheads for a simple reason. The only market for Russia left for Russian energy is China. So what they're actually doing is pushing the Iranians clean out of the Chinese market, leaving the Iranians with a very poor set of options. So all this arrogance may be an attempt to cover for a profound weakness, which is already beginning also to show within Iranian society, because Iranians are sick and tired of what the regime has done to them. So all of this is the core. This is the core. The JCPOA is reflective of an Iranian attitude, which must change.
Dr. Heinonen?
Yes, I think that this is pretty much right. And I think that the IAEA Board of Governors is in the junction. It has been there before. You remember in early 1990s in the case of Iraq, the request for the IAEA to inspect under 687 Iraq didn't come through the IAEA board. It was a request directly from the Security Council. And IAEA board was passed because of inaction. But then it realized and learned the lesson and got more involved. But it would be very difficult to get this Chapter 7 through, I think, immediately in the UN Security Council for obvious reasons. But there is also now a new mechanism in the Security Council. You remember the Ukraine case was taken to the UN General Assembly. There was a vote, and 5 countries joined Russia. They were Eritrea, North Korea, Iran, and Syria. Similar thing can be done also with Iran, if the Security Council is not able to make a resolution. Certainly the General Assembly resolution is non-binding, but it will send a signal to those who do the trading still with Iran, with the oil and other commodities, that they have to come out of their shell and vote either for the resolution, against it, or abstain. And such kind of resolution sends a good signal to the world and may put China and Russia to rethink the problem.
If I'm not mistaken, actually, Iran abstained in that specific vote, I think, for a larger degree because of the same point that Dr. Lerman has mentioned, with frustrations rising in Tehran over Russia taking over the scene in oil exports and gas exports to China, which, of course, is part of the Gazprom deal of 30 years, if I'm not mistaken, with China. But we're drawing near to the end of the program. I'd like to get some sort of understanding to what degree, once more, we understand the alarm behind Tehran's progress from a nuclear perspective, but to what degree are we in a stage of a point of no return, if you will? And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Heinonen.
I think that Iran feels that in nuclear terms that they are in a very strong position. And then when I look back to the historical developments, this is the way Pakistan went to nuclear. This is the way North Korea went to the nuclear when the international community was not strong enough. So I don't think that we can afford an additional such a failure. And even to keep Iran there on the threshold with these capabilities, which it can any day decide that it can go forward for uranium enrichment in some secret locations. We have to remember that we are not talking very many centrifuges here. If you want to go from, let's say, 20% enriched uranium to 90% on one go. So tools with the international community are limited. At this point of time, I think that the best tool is the intelligence. It is the most productive tool at this point in time, much better than the limited, prohibited access of the IAEA, unfortunately.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman?
At the end of the day, North Korea could build a bomb because South Korea would not fight, would never allow American military action because the consequences would have been ruinous for the miracle on the Han River. Mm-hmm. Israel, if no other choice is left, and there are all sorts of Plan B elements in between the present war, which is already underway, and an all-out kinetic attack. But if no other choice is left, I believe that Israel would take action.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Heinonen, Dr. Lerman, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.